Hey there, Harvest Glen family and friends. It's good to be with you again. Just to let you all know who's watching with us online, we have started meeting again in person. We're meeting down at the church building 11 a.m. We're not doing Sunday school, but we are meeting at 11 a.m. Every Sunday. Decided to go ahead and keep on recording for as long as we can. For those of you who, for health or safety reasons, do not feel comfortable meeting with us, we want to make this available to you as we're starting a new sermon series through Esther. We hope that you can make it, but we're going to ask that you go ahead and be led by your conscience on that one, that if you can make it, that you would make every effort to be there with us in person. But if you cannot, we're happy to make these available to you online. We pray that the Lord will use them powerfully in your life. Well, as I just mentioned, we're starting a new sermon series. It's one that I'm very excited to lead us through. It's through the book of Esther. The book of Esther is often pretty neglected overall by Christians. It's not one that we read a lot, not one that I remember really being preached on at all, except for maybe the famous "For such a time as this" passage, or maybe seeing some felt board stories, seeing the VeggieTales version growing up. For the most part, it's probably a book we don't know very much about. But I'm happy to bring us through it, and I believe that the Lord will have much to say to us in it. I'm calling the sermon series God Behind the Scenes. And that's, I believe, very appropriate for the book of Esther, because God's name is not mentioned once in the book of Esther. It's very difficult to see God's hand in the book of Esther overtly, although once you read kind of between the lines, it's very clear that He is there and He is at work saving His people through Esther. There's a famous phrase that we like to say. Well, it's that hindsight is 20/20. That if we would have known then what we know now, we wouldn't have done the same things, right? Things are always much more clear to us in hindsight, in the rearview mirror. And I believe that God's providence and God's sovereignty often works the same way in our lives, that it's often only recognized when we look back on it. That when we're going through certain things in our life, it's hard to understand that God has a plan for it. How He's going to keep His promise in Romans 8:28, that He's working out all things together for good for those who love Him and are called according to His purpose. But we have a trustworthy God who keeps His promises, and in Esther, we're really given a backstage pass to what's going on. I want you to try, if you can, to put yourself in the story as much as possible, as if you didn't know how it was going to end, as if right there along with them, you were having a hard time seeing what God was doing. We're really given a backstage pass to that. Well, before we jump into the book of Esther, and we've got a lot to cover. We've got 2 chapters to cover today. Real briefly, I think it's important to know what's going on in Israel's history when the book of Esther is written, when the events took place. Well, just a very broad brush recap of Israel's history. We know that mankind was created and placed in the Garden of Eden. Adam and Eve were created to dwell with God in His place in the Garden of Eden under His rule and blessing. That's what we were created for, and before sin entered the world, that was the reality. Is mankind was dwelling with God. Adam and Eve walked with God, and all things were as they should be. But as you know, things didn't stay that way for very long, and mankind rebelled against God and sinned against Him, and as a result, our world fell under the curse of sin. Death entered the world, and Adam and Eve were exiled from the Garden of Eden. They were cast out, no longer to dwell physically with God anymore. And we know after the events of the flood and God really wiping out the whole earth's population except for one family, He really began anew and eventually would make His covenant. He would enter into a promise to be the God of Abraham. And not just with Abraham, but all his descendants, which would become the nation of Israel. The nation of Israel would grow to be a strong and powerful nation under the rule and reign of kings that we're familiar with, like King David and King Solomon. But unfortunately, those glory days also did not last very long. After Solomon, the kingdom split in two, Israel in the north and Judah in the south. And what began to happen is Israel as a whole, both Israel and Judah, began to sin repeatedly, just as they had done before they were a powerful nation. And they repeatedly sinned against God and worshiped other gods instead of the one true God. And what happened was God sent His prophets to them to announce a judgment that's coming, urging His people to repent before it was too late. But Israel was a hard-hearted people. And just like us, they needed the Holy Spirit to change their heart. And so Israel was really destroyed by Assyria first, one of the nations that God used to bring judgment on His people. And later on, Judah was taken into captivity. They were taken into exile by Babylon. So by the time of Esther, what's happened is the people of Israel have been taken into exile. They've been taken out of the land, out of the presence of God there in the temple, to meet with God in the temple. They've been taken into exile, and things are not as they should be. When we pick up our story in Esther, the nation of Israel has really changed hands from Babylon to Persia. Babylon was the great world power that took them into exile, but now a new world power has come, and it is the empire of Persia. And so, 60 years prior to the events of Esther, some Jews were allowed to return home. That's where we get the events of Ezra and Nehemiah. Some were allowed to go home and begin to rebuild the walls, rebuild the temple. But some stayed right where they were for whatever reason, whether they were not allowed to go or they chose to stay. And 60 years go by, and Israel is still in exile in the land of Persia. But we're going to see that God still has a plan for His people. And let's begin to look at that in chapter 1, verse 1 in the book of Esther. Let's read together. It says, "Now in the days of Ahasuerus, the Ahasuerus who reigned from India to Ethiopia, over 127 provinces. In those days when King Ahasuerus sat on his royal throne in Susa, the citadel, in the 3rd year of his reign, he gave a feast for all his officials and servants, the army of Persia and Media, and the nobles and governors of the province who were before him, while he showed the riches of his royal glory in the splendor and pomp of his greatness for many days, 180 days." So what we have here is the book opens with displaying the greatness of the Persian king. Now, in the book of Esther, he's always referred to as Ahasuerus. That's his Persian name. But he's better known throughout history from the Greek histories as King Xerxes. Perhaps you've heard of him. So from now on, when we see his name, I'm going to go ahead and refer to him as Xerxes. That's a little less complicated for us. And what King Xerxes is doing is, it's shown from the very beginning that he reigns over a vast empire that stretches from northern Africa all the way to modern-day Pakistan. This was most of the known world at this time. It was the greatest empire the world had ever seen, containing 127 provinces. And he holds this great feast in front of all his armies and his rulers and his citizens for 180 days. It's quite a party to show off his, as it says in verse 4, his glory and his splendor and his pomp and his greatness. He wants the world, he wants his subjects to know just how great he is. Read with me in verse 5. And it says, "And when these days were completed, the king gave for all the people present in Susa, the citadel, both great and small, a feast lasting for 7 days in the court of the garden of the king's palace. Now there were white cotton curtains and violet hangings fastened with cords of fine linen and purple to silver rods and marble pillars, also couches of gold and silver on a mosaic pavement of porphyry, marble, mother of pearl, and precious stones. Drinks were served in golden vessels of different kinds, and the royal wine was lavished according to the bounty of the king. And drinking was according to this edict: there is no compulsion, for the king had given orders to all the staff of his palace to do as each man desired. Queen Vashti also gave a feast for the women in the palace that belonged to King Ahasuerus." So after this great feast of 180 days, we're told of 2 more feasts. How often do you get done with a party that lasted 4 months and you decide, I should probably throw another one? Maybe just a week long this time. That's what King Xerxes thought. So after his great feast, he throws a second one, just a week long this time. And we're seeing that this is a great and magnificent feast, all kinds of beautiful dressings and vessels of gold and couches of gold. Certainly quite a scene. We're told of a third feast that his queen, she's going to feature in the story in just a moment. She was throwing a feast elsewhere in Susa, the citadel, for the women. Now, one thing I think is interesting, and it shows us a bit of Xerxes' character some more here, is in verse 8. He makes a royal edict, a royal decree, letting people know that they're free to drink. Now, we're seeing that Xerxes, he really has some control issues. I mean, who makes a law to remind people that they're free to do what they want? I mean, that would be like calling all the kids together, putting them in timeout, and then letting them know, hey, by the way, you're free to go play again. You got some control issues, Xerxes. So in the midst of all this partying and drinking and feasting, a problem is going to occur for Xerxes. Look with me in verse 10. It says, on the seventh day, the last day of the feast, when the heart of the king was merry with wine, that's a polite way to say he was quite drunk, he commanded Mehuman, Biztha, Harbona, Bigtha, and Abagtha, Zethar, and Carcass, the 7 servants who served in the presence of King Xerxes. He commanded his servants to bring Queen Vashti before the king with her royal crown, in order to show the peoples and the princes her beauty, for she was lovely to look at. But Queen Vashti refused to come at the king's command delivered by the servants. At this, the king became enraged, and his anger burned within him. This great king, who is able to throw a magnificent feast for 180 days, tack on a week after that, this great king who's concerned that everyone know his power and prominence, that they know his great abundance of riches, he is shown here to not even be able to control his own wife. And this is embarrassing for his frail ego. This is a problem. See, for King Xerxes, people are not companions. They are objects for his agenda and for his desired outcomes and ends. And we see just how he treats his queen. He wants to show her off. He wants her to strut around and show off just how beautiful she is. Now, we don't know why Queen Vashti refuses to come at Xerxes' beck and call, but for some reason she decides she's not going to obey him, and Xerxes is furious. He is absolutely furious with her. I think he shows that even in all his power and supposed greatness, he cannot even ensure what his own wife is going to do. I want us to see this morning in this first chapter that only God is great. The narrator of this story, we don't know who wrote the book of Esther, but whoever wrote it wants us to see that, look, Xerxes wants everyone to know how great and powerful he is, but there's cracks beneath the surface. We're getting hints that though he has great power, control issues, he wants everyone to know how great he is. Ultimately, that's the thing about power, is you can't control everything. And this becomes true with his own wife, Queen Vashti. So the king has a problem on his hand. Look with me in verse 13. So basically the king asks his wise men what he is to do. He calls them together. They're listed by name in verse 14. He asks them in verse 15, according to the law, what is to be done to Queen Vashti, because she has not performed the command of King Xerxes delivered by the servants. So Xerxes is basically asking those who are versed in the law what he can do about it. See, Xerxes, he's got some serious power control issues, right? He's taking a domestic dispute and he's making it to this great crisis, this state affair that's got to be addressed before the whole empire. So one of his wise men is named Memucan in verse 16. This is what he says to the king, verse 16. He said, not only against the king has Queen Vashti done wrong, but also against all the officials and all the peoples who are in all the provinces of King Xerxes. For the queen's behavior will be made known to all women, causing them to look at their husbands with contempt. Since they will say, King Xerxes commanded Queen Vashti to be brought before him, and she didn't come. So he recommends, this very day, the noble women of Persia and Media who have heard of the queen's behavior will say the same to all the king's officials, and there will be contempt and wrath and plenty. So if it please the king, let a royal order go out from him, and let it be written among the laws of the Persians and the Medes so that it cannot be repealed, that Vashti is never again to come before King Xerxes. And let the king give her royal position to another who is better than she. So when the decree made by the king is proclaimed throughout all his kingdom, for it is vast, all women will give honor to their husbands, high and low alike. And this advice pleased the king and the princes, and the king did as Memucan proposed. So they sent letters to all the royal provinces, all 127 of them, to every province in its own script and to every people in its own language, that every man be master in his own household and speak according to the language of his people. So basically, Memucan takes this issue with Vashti and Xerxes, and he makes it an affront to male dominance everywhere. He's saying to Xerxes, if you don't put Vashti in check, all women everywhere in the whole empire are going to start to disobey, and there's going to be serious problems. So what you need to do is you need to get rid of Queen Vashti and issue an order throughout the whole empire that men are to be in charge and to rule over their wives. Now, maybe in a sick, twisted way, this passage has been used in the church to support male headship and biblical submission. Well, just to make this clear, this is not describing biblical submission. What this is dominance and suppression and an overreach. It's someone using the law and twisting the law for their own ends and their own purposes. We believe in biblical submission. We believe that is God's design for the family and for our flourishing, that men would lead well in their households, and that wives would submit to their husbands with all respect, and that husbands would love their wives as Christ loved the church. But that is not what's going on here, and let's not use this passage to argue for that. Basically, chapter 1 sets the stage for chapter 2. Because of Xerxes' drunken decisions to get rid of his wife, Queen Vashti, because of her disobedience, Esther is going to be able to rise to save the Jewish people in their great hour of need. God is going to use even the foolish decisions of a pagan king who thinks he's all that to set up his plans and purposes. I want to ask us some questions here at the end of chapter 1. How often do we place a great worth or value in accumulation and abundance? That's what we see with Xerxes here. He wants everyone to see all of his stuff, all of his possessions, his pomp and splendor and greatness. Now, Xerxes had most of the known world. He had the greatest empire at that time, but it's not enough for him. He needs everyone to see it and everyone to recognize it. How often does this desire for praise or recognition rise up in us? We may not reign from Africa to Western Asia. We may not have near as much as Xerxes has, but I believe that same sinful heart can also be at work in us when we want to be praised and we want to be recognized. Philippians chapter 2, verse 3, we're encouraged to have the mind of Christ and to do nothing from selfish ambition or conceit, but in humility to count others as more significant than ourselves. Do we do that? Another question we need to ask is, do we as Christians see ourselves as exiles in this world? See, I believe the book of Esther can really speak to us, because just as the Jews were exiled, they were living in a land that was not their own in the Persian Empire. We can relate to that. You see, this world is ultimately not our home. Peter, in his first epistle, In chapter 1, verse 1 calls us elect exiles. In chapter 2, verse 11, he reminds us that we are sojourners and exiles in this life. What does he mean by that? What does the Bible mean when it calls us as Christians sojourners, exiles? It means that ultimately this land is not our home, that we belong to another kingdom, and it's not of this world. We've been transferred from the kingdom of darkness into the kingdom of light, and so yes, we live in this world, we engage with it, we become salt and light in it, we live as disciples in it, but remember, it's not our home, and it is not the object of our hope and trust. It can't be. So, our hope, Christians, is not in our government. The Jews' hope was certainly not in Xerxes. He will do them no favors, as we'll see in the upcoming chapters. And for us, our hope is not in our government. Things are very difficult right now in our current environment. We see everything going on in the news, and we want answers, we want resolutions, we want things to get better. Let's hope in the one who can ultimately change things, and the only one who can bring peace and reconciliation to those who are hostile to one another. Another question is, do we daily recognize Jesus as our King? Abraham Kuyper, he said this: "There is not a square inch in the whole domain of our human existence over which Christ, who is sovereign over all, does not cry, 'Mine.'" Do our lives reflect the reality that Jesus is King? Does our lives ultimately reflect that we've sworn allegiance to Him, that we've surrendered our lives and laid it down for King Jesus? We're going to see that as King, God is doing things for His own glory and own purposes, even when we can't see Him at work. There is a hand at work behind the scenes, and we're going to see that very quickly in chapter 2. If chapter 1 shows us that only God is great, chapter 2 is going to show us that only God is sovereign and in control. Read with me in chapter 2, verse 1. It says, "After these things, when the anger of King Xerxes had abated, he remembered Vashti and what she had done and what had been decreed against her. Then the king's young men who attended him said, 'Let beautiful young virgins be sought out for the king, and let the king appoint officers in all the provinces of his kingdom to gather all the beautiful young virgins to the harem in Susa the citadel, under custody of Hegai, the king's servant, who is in charge of the women, and let their cosmetics be given to them. And let the young woman who pleases the king be queen instead of Vashti.' This pleased the king, and he did so." So the search begins for the next queen who's going to replace Vashti. And I want to be clear here of what's going on. This is not a beauty contest. It's really not. And oftentimes it gets shaped as this. We often whitewash stories that are difficult. I think about how Noah and the ark, Noah and the flood, is often a very popular story to tell for kids. And it's shown as, Noah floating in his ark with all the animals sticking their heads out of the ark and a rainbow over it. But we realize what actually happened in that story, right? God wiped off the face of the earth all of sinful humanity and saved one family. Massive devastation and destruction and judgment. But we whitewash it. It makes a better story. It's harder to depict that level of judgment on a felt board, isn't it? Well, oftentimes we're more influenced by the felt board and by VeggieTales' portrayal of a story than we are in the actual biblical account. What's going on here is not kind of an American Idol or The Voice audition. What's going on is kidnap and rape and ultimately permanent separation from everything that these women have ever known. And that's going to become clearer to us as we move along through the story. Look with me in chapter 5, or verse 5. We're going to meet two very important characters to the book of Esther. Verse 5 says, "Now there was a Jew in Susa, the citadel, whose name was Mordecai, the son of Jair, son of Shmi, son of Kish, a Benjaminite, who had been carried away from Jerusalem among the captives, carried away with Jeconiah, king of Judah, who Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, had carried away. He was bringing up Hadassah, that is Esther, the daughter of his uncle, for she had neither father nor mother. The young woman had a beautiful figure and was lovely to look at. And when her father and mother died, Mordecai took her as his own daughter. So here, the narrator really pauses the action, pauses the story, and introduces us to both Mordecai and Esther. Now, for a Jew, an Israelite, reading the book of Esther, the introduction of Mordecai would have raised some serious red flags. Now, it says that he's a Jew, but his name is Mordecai. That Mordecai is not a Jewish name. Mordecai is not of Israelite descent. That name, anyway. Mordecai is named after a Babylonian god named Marduk. Not only has he kind of lost his Jewish identity with his very name, but he's not living with the Jewish people. There would have been a Jewish ghetto or a Jewish district. There were Jews scattered all throughout the Empire of Persia. But Mordecai is in Susa. He's in the capital city. And he's not just in Susa, he's in the citadel of Susa, which was where the king's palace was, this great fortress. So for him to be in Susa, in the capital city, and not just in the capital, but in the center of power, and to have gotten rid of his Jewish name, that would have raised some serious red flags. Why has he gotten rid of his identity? Why is he not living with his Jewish brothers and sisters? He's described as a Benjaminite. He's from the line of King Saul. He's got royal blood in him. Shmi and Kish, these are Saul's relatives. He belongs to the family of the covenant, but he's begun to lose his identity. And we learn the same of Esther. He was bringing up Hadassah. That's Esther's Hebrew name, her Jewish name. But throughout the whole book, she's known as Esther. She is not known by her Jewish name. She's an orphan. She's beautiful, and ultimately she's adopted by Mordecai, her cousin, and raised by him. So what we see here, and what the narrator, what the author wants us to know, is that you've got two Jews, but their identities are compromised. They've begun to assimilate along with the Persians. They've begun to blend in. But God has a plan even for those such as this. In verse 8, it says, "So when the king's order and his edict were proclaimed, and when many young women were gathered in Susa, the citadel, Esther was taken into the king's palace and put in custody." Verse 9, "The young woman pleased Haggai, the king's servant, and won his favor, and he quickly provided her with her cosmetics and her portion of food, and with 7 chosen young women from the king's palace, and advanced her and her young women to the best place in the harem. Esther had not made known her people or kindred, for Mordecai had commanded her not to make it known. And every day Mordecai walked in front of the court of the harem to learn how Esther was and what was happening to her. Now when the turn came for each young woman to go in to King Xerxes, after being 12 months under the regulations for the women, since this was the regular period of their beautifying, 6 months with oil of myrrh, and 6 months with spices and ointments for women. When the young woman went into the king in this way, she was given whatever she desired to take with her from the harem to the king's palace. In the evening she would go in, and in the morning she would return to the second harem in custody of Shashgaz, the king's eunuch, who was in charge of the concubines. She would not go in to the king again unless the king delighted in her and she was summoned by name. When the turn came for Esther, the daughter of Abihail, the uncle of Mordecai, who had taken her as his own daughter to go into the king, she asked for nothing except what Haggai, the king's servant who had charge of the women, advised, and says, "Now Esther was winning favor in the eyes of all who saw her." So this search for the queen begins to happen. They round up all these beautiful young women, these virgins from around the empire. It's estimated that the number of women that were going to be brought in simply for the king's pleasure was in the hundreds, if not the low thousands of women. And basically what's being described here in the verses that we just read is a woman, she would be in this beautifying process for at least a year. She was undergoing these beauty treatments, preparing her for the life of a sex slave for a year. She would get one night with the king, and unless the king remembered her name and wanted her again, she would go off to the second harem. And basically, she was pretty much doomed to a future of permanent widowhood and separation from her family. See, once you were in the king's harem, once you belonged to the king, as one of these women, your options were pretty slim and not very desirable. See, your options were you would either become a concubine and the king would ask for you again. Maybe you would become one of his many wives, kind of one of the more favored of the women. Or, like we're going to see with Esther, you might just become the queen. But for most and actually all of these women, this was permanent separation from their families. There was no guarantee that the king was going to remember your name, going to remember you and bring you back to his presence. This is a dark situation. This is a horrific situation. This is human trafficking, rape, and sex slavery. What Xerxes shows us, he doesn't just have control issues. He shows us the danger of living life as a consumer. You see, for Xerxes, everything revolves around him and his pleasure and his agenda and his wants, his needs. Other people are just seen as sort of objects and just his pawns that he can move around. For Xerxes, the ultimate goal of life is pleasure. It's expansion of his kingdom. It's enjoying these women that have been brought to him. And I believe if we're not careful, we can begin to see life in the same way. We begin to live as consumers. It's so ingrained in the American mindset just to live life as a consumer. We may do this unintentionally with our spouses. We're looking for someone who completes us, who makes us happy. We can do this with church, where we come to church and we show up and we treat church like a drive-through, really, where we pull up, we get what we want, we get what we need, and we leave. We check in and we check out. We are takers more than we're givers. Maybe someone asks us, how did church go? And we say, well, I didn't really like the songs today, or I didn't really like the message today. It didn't really do anything for me. That's living life as a consumer. See, when we show up at church, we should be seeking to worship the God who is and looking for ways to serve one another and love one another. It shouldn't be, what can I take? What can I get? How can I be fed? Only. It should be, how can I serve my brothers and sisters? If we're not careful, our spouses, our church, our friends, our workplaces, our whole lives, we can get it twisted that the purpose of it is simply our pleasure, to have a good time. But this is not what we see from the people of faith. This is not what we see even from Mordecai. See, back in verse 11, what it says is, as Esther was brought into the harem, what Mordecai did every single day was he went and he checked on her. He went and got as close as he possibly could, and he inquired what was happening to her, what was her situation. He shows a care for those who cannot protect themselves. He shows a care for those most marginalized and oppressed and needy in the people of God. Do we show the same care and concern for one another? These are difficult times. Coronavirus riots going on. Certainly, imagine many of us are suffering on many levels, mentally, spiritually, emotionally, physically. Are we caring for those most at risk and most needy among us? See, it's not just Mordecai who does this. Ultimately, there is one who is better than Mordecai, and his name is Jesus. In Mark chapter 10, James and John came to Jesus and they wanted positions of power, positions of respect and authority in the kingdom. And they misunderstood the nature of Jesus' kingdom. And Jesus really used their request as a teaching moment for the disciples. And this is what he said to them. It says, Jesus called them to him and said to them,
You know that those who are considered rulers of the Gentiles lord it over them, and their great ones exercise authority over them. Sounds like Xerxes, doesn't it? But it shall not be so among you. But whoever would be great among you must be your servant, and whoever would be first among you must be slave of all. For even the Son of Man came not to be served, but to serve, and to give his life down as a ransom for many. Jesus came to lay down his life. He didn't come to be served. He came to serve. He came to be with sinners, to eat with tax collectors and prostitutes. You see, Jesus didn't wait for sinners to stop sinning before he loved them, and neither should we. I think we can take a cue from Jesus' example in our cultural moment in America. You see, our response to everything going on shouldn't be merely to condemn the protests, but it should be to seek to understand what caused it, to understand the underlying injustices that have been committed against the black community for years. If we are more concerned with order than we are for justice, we've got a problem. It's not only that that's unbiblical, but even if we approach this situation with apathy, that's also a problem. You see, for us to simply wash our hands of it like Pilate and say, that's not my problem, I don't have a dog in this fight, that's simply not an option for us as Christians. You see, Esther wasn't Mordecai's daughter. Technically, he could have washed his hands and said, not my problem, find your own way, Esther. But what did he do? He adopted her, and he continued to look after her well-being even when she was brought into the harem. You see, we were God's enemies and not sons. We were not a part of the flock of God. We were alienated from God. We were dead in our sins, but he sent his Son. He went on a divine rescue mission, and he came and he sought us out. Jesus didn't wash his hands of us and say, good luck, you're on your own. No, he came and he put on flesh and lived among us, suffered like us and died for us. Surely we as Christians, those who claim to follow this Jesus, surely we can empathize with those who are hurting in our culture right now, in our nation. Does our reaction to the protest, to the violence, to all the injustice, does it reveal a heart like Xerxes that's concerned with order and control? Or does it reveal a heart like Jesus who weeps with those who weeps? Who lives among us, who comforts us in our affliction, who cares for the brokenhearted, binds them up. What heart are we reflecting? We're going to see that even in our darkest moments, like many of us are facing right now, we're devastated by all that's going on. Even in our darkest moments, God is there and he's at work. Certainly the case with Esther. Look at in verse 16 of chapter 2. It says, when Esther was taken to King Ahasuerus into his royal palace in the 10th month, which is the month of Tebeth, in the 7th year of his reign, it says the king loved Esther more than all the other women, and she won grace and favor in his sight more than all the virgins, so that he set the royal crown on her head and made her queen instead of Vashti. It says, then the king gave a great feast for all his officials and servants. It was Esther's feast. And he also granted a remission of taxes to the provinces and gave gifts with royal generosity. Against all odds, Esther rises to become queen. It says Esther won favor. In verse 9, when she was placed under Haggai's authority, it said the young woman pleased him and she won favor. Verse 15, it said, now Esther was winning favor in the eyes of all those who saw her. Esther goes in and spends the night with the king and says he loved her, and she won grace and favor in his sight more than all others. I want us to see that this is simply not a coincidence. This is not because of Esther's worth either. This is not because of her personality or her beauty. You see, Esther in all of chapter 2, if you'll notice, she really does nothing. She kind of goes along with what's happening to her. She doesn't do anything remarkable or noteworthy.
but yet she finds favor time and time again. And the reason why is because of God's blessing in her life and God's sovereign hand leading her where He wants her. I want us to see that even though she found favor time and time again, and we see God's hand at work in her life, it doesn't mean that she escaped suffering or that she escaped the pain of belonging to the king's harem. But it does mean that He was there with her. He continued to provide for her. God was setting up Esther as queen for reasons she could not yet see. In church, it's simply the same with us. We've been chosen like Esther. We've been given God's blessing, and we've received so much grace and favor from our King. Grace and mercy. God continuing to make beauty out of the ashes of our lives. But it doesn't mean that we avoid suffering or pain, just like Esther. But it does mean that He is there with us. Let's conclude by looking at the last part of chapter 2, setting us up for next week. So Esther becomes queen, and the plot shifts attention to Mordecai briefly. Verse 19. It says, "Now when the virgins were gathered together the second time, Mordecai was sitting at the king's gate. Esther had not made known her kindred to her people, as Mordecai had commanded her. For Esther obeyed Mordecai just as when she was brought up by him. In those days, as Mordecai was sitting at the king's gate, two of the king's servants named Bigthan and Teresh, who were guarding the threshold, they became angry, and they sought to lay hands on King Xerxes. And this came to the knowledge of Mordecai. And he told it to Queen Esther, and Esther told the king in the name of Mordecai. It says, when the affair was investigated and found to be so, the men were both hanged on the gallows, and it was recorded in the book of the Chronicles in the presence of the king." Now, again, there's so many seeming coincidences in the book of Esther, and this is one of them, right? It says, this came to the knowledge of Mordecai. Somehow, Mordecai finds out about this assassination plot from two of the king's servants to take King Xerxes' life. And Mordecai, he goes and he plays the part of a good citizen. This is an evil king, but he really saves his life by making this plot known to Esther. So Esther, she goes and tells the king in Mordecai's name. Not only was it in Mordecai's name, but it was written down in the official records, in the Chronicles, in the presence of the king. And that's where chapter 2 ends. We would expect Mordecai to be rewarded, wouldn't we? We would expect some reward, some praise, some recognition for saving the king's life, but the chapter just ends. Where's Mordecai's favor? Where's Mordecai's favor and recognition and grace? All these things that are being given to Esther, while she does really nothing. Why is Mordecai falling by the wayside? Church, I want us to see that often faithfulness is not immediately rewarded. We may find ourselves sometimes in more of a situation like Esther, but I think more often we find ourselves in a situation like Mordecai, whereas Esther really does nothing and is exalted to a supreme place of authority and influence. Mordecai saves the king's life, and he is not even immediately rewarded or recognized. Such is the ways of our sovereign God. Even though Mordecai and Esther cannot see it, He's setting them up to save His people. Next week, we're going to meet the enemy of the story. We're going to meet Haman. The plot is going to thicken. We're going to see that he's going to hatch a scheme to destroy all Jews everywhere. And through what looks like coincidence, whether it be Vashti's refusal to come to the party, whether it be Xerxes' drunken decision to depose her, whether it be Esther's selection or Mordecai's discovery of the plot, all these things that look like coincidence, they just seem to happen, are actually evidences of God's sovereign plan at work. He's working behind the scenes to save His people. Ultimately, I think Esther is a book that you and I can relate pretty well to. There's no mention of God in chapters 1 or 2. Actually, there's no mention of God in the whole book. There's no great miracles. There's no parting of the Red Sea, fire from heaven. Just the simple, everyday workings
inside the empire.
There's no perfect characters. Esther and Mordecai are suspect. Their identities are compromised, but they are the very ones that God is going to use. See, it's often the same way in our lives, isn't it? Sometimes we wish our lives would look more like Exodus than Esther, right? We want to be led by a pillar of smoke, a pillar of fire and a cloud of smoke. We want the miracles, we want the signs and the symbols, but often what we get is silence in the face of pain.
Sometimes we can't see God at work, just like Esther and Mordecai.
Oftentimes we're just like them. We want to be a Daniel, right? We want to stand up. We don't want to assimilate. But sometimes we're just not, we're not perfect and we're not in control. But God can use us. There's an illustration, a story I'd like to close with. I heard of a youth pastor who, when speaking before the youth, he brought up one of the kids, and he had the kids stand on stage with him. And he was really going to use this to teach the children something about trust and faith. And he takes the kid and he tells him, he holds up a pair of keys in front of him. And he says, "These keys will always be in front of you." The kid says, "Okay." So then he holds up the keys and he says, "Where are the keys?" And the young man says, "Well, right in front of me." He said, "How do you know?" He said, "Because I can see them." So then he has the kid blindfolded. And he holds the keys out in front of him and he jingles them around and he says, "Where are the keys?" The kid said, "Right in front of me." He said, "How do you know?" He said, "Because I can hear them." So then he holds the keys still in front of the kid, right in front of his face. And he says, "Where are the keys?" And the young man listened for them, but he instinctively reaches out and he touches the keys. And the youth pastor said, "Where are the keys?" The young man says, "Right in front of me." "Well, how do you know?" He said, "Because I can feel them." So then what he does is he takes a big step back and he holds the keys. And he says, "Where are the keys?" And the young man reaches out for them to grasp them, but he can't feel them. And thinking the youth pastor had a point to make, maybe he was going to trick him, he said, "I don't know." And he said, "Take off the blindfold." The young man saw that the keys were still right there. They were right in front of him. He said, "Where are the keys?" The young man said, "Right in front of me." And he said, "How do you know?" And he said, "It's because I promised you. I promised you that these keys would always be in front of you." There will be times in our lives when we can't see God, we can't hear God, we can't even feel Him with us. But remember, we can trust His promises. He promised to never leave us and never forsake us. He's there with us in the darkest of times. Just as in the book of Esther, we can trust that in our darkest moments, God is with us and He has a plan for us. Only God is great and only God is in control. I want to encourage you today, if you're not a part of the people of God, today you can know the one true King and come under His salvation and protection. Encourage you to seek the Lord while He may be found, and ultimately, if you're a Christian, to rest in His promises that He will be with you. No matter what, He will not forsake you. Let's pray. Dear Lord, I thank You for the opportunity to look at Esther, to start our study, to see that even when we can't see You, You're working, that You're at work behind the scenes. You are the only one who's in control, the only one who is ultimately powerful and good. Help us to trust You during this time. Help us to have the mind of Christ and to seek to serve one another, to seek to understand one another and to love one another as You have loved us. It's in Your name I pray. Amen.